The pressure came through the top of my right shoe, heavy, rhythmic, unmistakable. 1, 2, 3. I was standing at the counter with my back to the table, drying a coffee mug I'd already dried twice. I didn't turn around. My name is Robert Miller. I'm 65 years old. I spent 30 years with the Chicago Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit. I reviewed fraud cases. I trained investigators. I sat across tables from some of the most convincing, charming, and dangerous people I have ever met in my life. And I knew, the moment those 3 taps came through my shoe, that I was sitting at dinner with another one. My son Caleb was 32. The last time he'd used that signal, he was 6 years old, sitting on a wooden bench at his grandmother's funeral, small and overwhelmed. Pressing his small foot against mine in the dark because he didn't have words for what he needed. I had reached down and taken his hand without a word. We hadn't used it in 26 years. If this story is already pulling at something and you hit subscribe, give it a like, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from today. He used it tonight right after the woman across the table finished explaining how she planned to restructure his 401k. On her left ring finger, my late wife's ring. The Lakeshore Fund protects your assets, Elena said, in ways the standard employer plan simply cannot. I set the mug down. I knew what I was looking at. I'd looked at it 100 times. I just didn't know yet how far it had already gone. But my son had sent the signal. I wasn't going to be slow answering it. And what she didn't know yet was that the signal he sent after 26 years of silence was about to become the biggest mistake of her life. The radiator in Robert Miller's kitchen had been making that sound for 11 years. A low, irregular clanking, like something trapped inside the pipes trying to get out. Robert had long since stopped hearing it the way a man notices a problem. It had become background, the sound of Sunday evenings. The sound of the house settling into itself after another week had passed without his wife in it. He stood at the counter now, his back to the table, running the edge of a dish towel along the rim of a coffee mug he'd already dried twice. The smell of pot roast lingered in the air. Margaret's recipe, the one he'd been cooking from memory for 3 years. Never quite right, never quite wrong enough to stop trying. Outside, the January wind moved through the narrow streets of the North Side. With the particular meanness that Chicago reserved for the months when the lake was at its worst. It rattled the kitchen window in its frame. Robert didn't look up. Behind him, at the table, his son Caleb sat with his hands in his lap and his eyes on the tablecloth. Across from Caleb, Elena Vance was speaking. She had a voice like water, finding its level smooth, unhurried, adjusting to whatever surface it touched. Robert had noticed that about her from the first time Caleb brought her to the house, 7 months ago. She had walked in with a bottle of Malbec and a smile that knew exactly how wide to be, and she had looked around his kitchen. The way a contractor looks at a room before drawing up a bid. He'd told himself he was being ungenerous. He'd told himself that a retired investigator had a professional habit of seeing angles where there weren't any. He'd told himself a lot of things. The yield projection on a restructured 401k in Caleb's bracket. Elena was saying, is significantly stronger than letting it sit in the standard employer plan. Especially at 32. You've got time, but time is the one asset people consistently undervalue. She paused to pour from the Malbec she'd brought tonight as well, always a bottle, always the same label, always opened by her own hand. The wine caught the overhead light as it moved, and Robert watched it from the corner of his eye. The Lakeshore Fund in particular, she continued, has an 18-month return rate that outperforms 93% of equivalent investment vehicles. I've walked 3 clients through the restructuring this quarter alone. All of them are thanking me. Robert set the mug down on the counter. He picked up the dish towel again. He had 30 years with the Chicago Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit. 30 years of listening to people explain, in patient and reasonable voices, exactly why a transaction that looked irregular was actually entirely routine. 30 years of learning that the most effective lies are the ones that contain the most accurate information. Elena Vance's numbers were real. He'd looked up the Lakeshore Fund 2 weeks ago, after the 3rd Sunday dinner in a row where she'd mentioned it. The fund existed. Its returns were documented. The paperwork was clean. That was what bothered him. He turned slightly and let his gaze move to the counter beside the refrigerator, where Caleb had set down the mail when he came in. A quarterly statement from Caleb's 401k plan sat on top of the stack, partially unfolded. Robert had noticed it the moment Caleb put it down. He noticed it again now. There was handwriting in the margin. Alina's handwriting. He'd seen enough of her notes over the past months to recognize the particular way she formed her sevens. The small, economical print that took up exactly as much space as it needed and no more. She had written figures there, circled a number, drawn a small arrow. She had already been reading his son's retirement account statement. Had already begun marking what she would take. Robert set the dish towel on the counter and moved to the table. He pulled out his chair, the one at the head, the one that had been his for 31 years of Sunday dinners, and sat down. He reached for the breadbasket. His movements were unhurried. His face was the face he had worn in 100 interview rooms, the one that gave nothing. Elena was still talking. Something about tax-advantaged accounts, about the difference between a traditional and a Roth conversion. About a window of opportunity that closed at the end of the first quarter. Caleb was nodding. The nodding had a rhythm to it that Robert recognized from somewhere deep. And parental, the rhythm of a person who has stopped processing words and is simply waiting for silence. Under the table, Robert felt it. Heavy, deliberate, rhythmic, tap, tap, tap. His son's foot pressing down on the top of Robert's right shoe. The way a man presses a hand against a door to keep it from swinging open. 3 taps, measured and even, and then nothing. The breadbasket was in his hands. He tore a piece along the grain of the loaf and set the rest back down. His breathing did not change. The expression on his face did not change. 30 years of interview rooms. He looked at Caleb. Caleb was looking at Elena. His hands were on the table now, both of them, wrapped around the stem of his wineglass with a grip that had gone white at the knuckles. The glass itself was nearly full. He hadn't been drinking. Robert hadn't noticed that until this moment, and the noticing of it settled into his chest like a stone dropping into still water. Elena said something about authorization and timing. She reached into the folio she always brought to Sunday dinner, a slim, dark leather portfolio that she set on the corner of the table. Like a briefcase on a conference room desk, and produced a single sheet of paper. She slid it across the table toward Caleb with the easy confidence of someone who has performed this particular gesture many times before. It's just a preliminary form, she said. Authorizes the initial consultation fee and opens the account review process. Nothing binding. Think of it as a first conversation between your money and its potential. Robert looked at his son. Caleb looked at the paper. Then he looked up, across the table, directly at Robert. There was something in his eyes that Robert hadn't seen since Caleb was small, not fear exactly. But the thing that lives just below fear, the recognition that a situation has moved beyond the edges of what a person knows how to handle alone. Everything is fine, Dad, Caleb said. His voice was steady, his voice was careful, and his knuckles were still white around the stem of the wineglass. Robert pulled a piece of bread apart with his fingers and said nothing. The radiator clanked twice in the pipes behind the wall. The wind pressed against the kitchen window. Elena set her pen on the table beside the authorization form, parallel to the edge, precisely placed. The kitchen smelled like pot roast and Malbec and something Robert could not name. But recognized the particular staleness of a room where the air has stopped moving freely because something in it is taking up space it was never meant to occupy. He thought about the 401k statement on the counter. The handwriting in the margin. The 7 circled figures. The small, economical arrow pointing toward a number that represented 10 years of his son's working life. He thought about 3 taps on the top of his shoe. He thought about a 6-year-old boy at a funeral, pressing his small foot down in the dark, looking for something solid in a room full of strangers. Elena picked up her pen. No pressure tonight, of course. I just want Caleb to have the information he needs to make an informed decision. That's all I've ever wanted. She smiled. The smile was warm and measured and exactly the right width. Robert reached for the bread basket again and said, "Tell me more about the Lakeshore Fund." The silence that opened after he said it was not peaceful. It was the particular silence of a room where the balance of something has shifted without anyone yet naming what shifted or how. Elena's pen paused over the form. Caleb's grip on the wine glass did not loosen. Outside, the Chicago wind moved through the streets and said nothing useful to anyone. But the tap had already been sent. And Robert Miller had already received it. The garage was cold in the way that only an attached Chicago garage in January can be cold, not the open, honest cold of the street. But something trapped and concentrated, the chill absorbed into concrete and metal over decades. And released slowly, without urgency, into the skin of anyone who stood still long enough to receive it. Caleb stood with his back against the workbench, his arms crossed over his chest, and his breath coming out in short, visible clouds that dissolved before they reached the ceiling. The single overhead bulb threw a hard circle of yellow light over the center of the space and left the corners in shadow. Robert's old Buick sat along the left wall. Between the car and the bench, father and son occupied a strip of floor barely wide enough to pace in. Which was what Caleb had been doing for the first 2 minutes after they came out here. Then he stopped pacing, and he reached into the interior pocket of his jacket with the careful, deliberate motion of a man retrieving something he has been carrying for too long. And is only now allowing himself to set down. He held out an envelope. Robert took it. The return address was from a mortgage servicer, one of the mid-size ones. Not the big national names, the kind of company that handles accounts transferred from other lenders. The envelope had already been opened and resealed, imperfectly, the flap slightly warped where moisture had been applied. Robert knew what that looked like. He had documented it in evidence files more times than he could count. He unfolded the letter inside. It was a formal overdue notice 90 days past due on a mortgage payment attached to an address on West Belmont. Caleb's address. The balance listed was not small. "She's been taking the mail in before I get home," Caleb said. His voice had the flat, careful quality of someone speaking about a thing they haven't yet let themselves fully believe. "I thought she was just, I don't know what I thought. She said she liked being the one to sort through it. She said it was something she could do to help, since I work the long shifts." He paused. "I found it in her bag 3 weeks ago. I put it back. I didn't know what to do with knowing it." Robert refolded the letter and held it. "How long has she been at your address?" he asked. 5 months. Give or take. And your mail was coming to you normally before that?" "It was fine. I had autopay set up on the mortgage. I hadn't missed a payment in 4 years." Caleb looked at the floor. "She had me change the autopay account. She said it was more efficient to run everything through one account for tax purposes. She had an explanation for everything. She always has an explanation." Robert set the letter on the workbench behind him. He looked at his son, at the set of his shoulders, at the way he was holding himself. Together with the visible effort of a man gripping something that keeps trying to slip. Caleb had his mother's eyes and his father's jaw, and right now the jaw was doing the work his eyes couldn't quite manage. "There's something else," Caleb said. He reached into the same interior pocket and produced a second document, this one folded in thirds. He unfolded it on the workbench under the light. Robert leaned in. It was a power of attorney form. A durable financial POA, the kind that grants broad authority over banking accounts, investment accounts, and financial transactions. Caleb's name was printed in the designated fields. Elena Vance's name appeared in the agent line. The notary block at the bottom was blank. 2 signature lines, one for Caleb, one for the witness, were empty. "She wants me to sign it by Monday morning," Caleb said. "She said it's a standard part of the wealth management process. She said her other clients all sign one. She said it protects me because it gives her legal standing to act on my behalf if anything, if I were ever incapacitated, or traveling, or..." He stopped. He pressed his fingers against the edge of the workbench. "She had an explanation for this one too." Robert didn't touch the form. He looked at it for a long time, reading the specific language in the authority clause. The scope of the powers being transferred, the absence of any limiting provisions that would restrict the agent's access to specific accounts or cap the dollar amounts involved. A POA of this scope, signed and notarized, would give Elena Vance legal authority to liquidate Caleb's retirement account, redirect the proceeds, and conduct any financial transaction in Caleb's name without his presence or consent. It was not a wealth management tool. It was a key. "Has she asked you about beneficiary designations?" Robert asked. Caleb looked up. Last month. She said I should think about updating them. That the default designations from my employer plan were probably outdated. Has she mentioned insurance policies? Life insurance, disability coverage? A pause. She brought up disability insurance in November. Said I was underprotected for someone in a physical operations role. Robert was quiet for a moment. The Buick ticked softly as its engine cooled. Somewhere 2 blocks over, a dog was barking at something on the other side of a fence. Dad, Caleb said. The word came out lower than he intended. I thought she loved me. It was not a question. It was something a person says when they have stopped asking questions and arrived at the place where the answers live. And the answers are worse than the questions were. Robert looked at his son. Caleb's face in the garage light was the face of a man who had spent 7 months building something, trusting something. Leaning the full weight of his loneliness against something, and had just watched it shift beneath him. Not collapse, not yet. Shift. The way ice shifts under a foot before it gives. That moment of wrongness before the fall. I feel like I'm living with a ghost, Caleb said quietly. Like I'm in a house I recognize but nothing in it means what it used to mean. Robert reached out and put his hand briefly on the back of his son's neck, the same gesture he'd made when Caleb was 12 and had gotten his first losing grade and sat at the kitchen table staring at the paper like it had personally betrayed him. He held it for a moment. Then he let go. He looked back at the power of attorney form on the workbench. He looked at the overdue notice beside it. He thought about the 401k statement on the kitchen counter upstairs, with Alina's handwriting in the margin and her small, economical arrow pointing at a number that represented a decade of his son's life. He thought about what he knew about unlicensed wealth consultants who moved through a city like water, finding its level, adjusting to whatever surface they touched, because water doesn't care what it damages, only where it goes. Don't sign the form, Robert said. She'll know something is wrong. Let her wonder. Tell her you want your own attorney to review it. Tell her your company's HR requires an independent review of any POA involving retirement assets. Make it procedural. Keep it procedural. He picked up the overdue notice and folded it carefully. And give me a week. Caleb looked at him. In the harsh circle of the garage light, some of the vacancy had gone out of his expression. Replaced by something more specific, not hope exactly, not yet, but the beginning of a direction. The feeling of a hand on the back of your neck when you were 12 years old and the world has become briefly incomprehensible. What are you going to do? Caleb asked. What I spent 30 years doing, Robert said. He slipped the notice into his jacket pocket. I'm going to pay attention. The Chicago wind found a gap in the garage door seal and moved through it with a thin, persistent sound. Caleb looked at the power of attorney form. He folded it back into thirds and put it in his pocket. His hands, Robert noticed, had stopped shaking. They stood in the cold garage in the hard yellow light, and neither of them said anything more. There was nothing more that needed saying. The tap under the table had been acknowledged. The signal had been read. Whatever came next, they would face it from the same side of the table. The coffee shop Robert chose was on Michigan Avenue, in the part of the Loop where the buildings narrow the sky to a corridor and the foot traffic moves with the particular, purposeful rhythm of people who have meetings to reach. He'd picked it deliberately public, well lit, the kind of place where a raised voice would turn heads. And a woman's composure would be under constant, ambient observation. He'd sat in the same chair twice before this morning, at the same corner table, to understand the acoustics. Elena arrived 8 minutes late. Not enough to be rude, precisely enough to establish that her time was the variable in any equation. She wore a charcoal wool coat with a wide lapel, her dark hair pulled back cleanly. And she moved through the coffee shop with the contained, efficient energy of a woman who had learned long ago that the way you cross a room tells people everything they need to know about whether they can afford you. She sat across from Robert, set her leather portfolio on the table, and accepted the coffee he'd already ordered for her black, 2 sugars. Which he'd noted from 7 months of Sunday dinners without acknowledging that he'd remembered. She smiled instead, the smile that was always precisely as warm as the situation required. Robert, she said, I'm glad you wanted to talk. Caleb mentioned you had some questions about the restructuring. A few, Robert said. He had dressed plainly. A charcoal sweater, dark trousers, nothing that announced itself. He had his hands around his own coffee cup, and he looked at Elena the way he had looked at 1,000 people across tables like this one. With the settled, patient attention of a man who already knows where the conversation is going and is willing to take the long route to get there. "The Lakeshore Fund," he said. "Walk me through the fee structure." Elena set down her coffee. She opened her portfolio and produced a single laminated card, a one-page summary, professionally typeset. The kind of document that exists to communicate competence before any conversation about specifics begins. She slid it across the table. "Management fee is 1.4% annually on assets under management," she said. "There's a performance incentive tier that activates if the fund exceeds the benchmark by more than 3% in any given quarter. The rest of the details are in the full disclosure packet, which I've already shared with Caleb." Robert studied the card. "Who is the fund's registered investment advisor?" A pause. Brief, controlled. "The fund operates through a series of affiliated entities. The RIA registration is held at the parent level, which is Meridian Capital Strategies, based in Delaware. And you're licensed through Meridian?" The pause this time was marginally longer. "I hold a consulting agreement with Meridian, yes. The licensing structure is, are you Series 65 licensed?" Robert asked. He kept his voice entirely pleasant. Elena looked at him across the table. Something moved in her eyes, a recalibration. The adjustment a person makes when they realize the terrain has changed under them without their noticing. Then the smile came back, a degree or two cooler than it had been. "Robert," she said, "I understand that you're concerned. It's natural. You spent your career looking for problems where other people saw routine transactions. That kind of occupational perspective doesn't just turn off." She picked up her coffee. "But Caleb is 32 years old. He's a competent adult who is capable of making informed financial decisions. Your instinct to protect him is admirable. It's also, in this case, misplaced." "I'm sure it is," Robert said. "The work I do is entirely legitimate. My clients." "I'm sure your other clients are happy," Robert said. He looked at her steadily. "I was asking about the licensing." The coffee shop moved around them, the espresso machine. The conversation from the table to their left. The door opening to let in a gust of January air and a young couple in matching parkas. Elena set her cup down with a precision that communicated controlled irritation without expressing it. "Your fraud investigator instincts are a bit dated, Robert. The financial services landscape has evolved considerably since you were chasing paper trails in the 90s. Not every wealth management structure maps neatly onto the regulatory categories you're familiar with." She tilted her head slightly. "Caleb is a grown man. Your obsession with fraud is just your way of staying relevant." She said it lightly, as if it were a small, friendly observation. As if she were doing him a courtesy by naming something he might not be able to see about himself. Robert held her gaze. He had heard variations of that sentence for 30 years. From men in offices with good suits and better attorneys. From women who had built elaborate architectures of trust around financial instruments that didn't quite exist. From people who understood that the most effective weapon against scrutiny is the implication that the person applying it is the problem, too suspicious. Too old, too limited by their own narrow experience to understand the sophistication of what they're looking at. He had heard it. He had documented it. He had watched juries decide, 11 times out of 13, that the people who said it were wrong. He looked at Elena's hands, resting on the table on either side of her coffee cup. He had been watching them since she sat down. She had a habit of touching her left ring finger with her thumb when she was thinking, a small, unconscious gesture, the kind that develops around a piece of jewelry worn long enough to leave a mark in muscle memory. On her left ring finger, catching the light from the window, was a ring he recognized. He had bought it in 1987 from a jeweler on Wabash Avenue. A vintage setting, rose gold, with a small garnet surrounded by seed pearls. The kind of piece that had no great monetary value but an entirely specific irreplaceability. He had given it to Margaret on their second anniversary because she had admired it in the window of that shop for 3 months without saying anything about it. And he had learned, early in their marriage, to pay attention to the things she noticed without mentioning. Margaret had worn it on her right hand for 26 years. Caleb had taken it from the jewelry box in the weeks after she died. Robert had known. He had said nothing, because a son taking his mother's ring was not a thing to interrogate. He understood now what had happened. In a moment of grief still close enough to the surface to be manipulated, Caleb had given it to Elena. Robert could see, from the particular way Elena touched the ring without looking at it, that she wore it without sentiment. As an object, a symbol of the level of access she had achieved. The clatter of the busy coffee shop moved around them, cups and conversation. And the grinding of beans on the door and the cold air and the ordinary bright chaos of a public morning in a city that didn't stop for anyone's quiet devastation. Robert reached for his coffee. He took a sip. He set the cup down. "Thank you for meeting me," he said. Elena studied him. The recalibration was happening again behind her eyes. The calculation of what this conversation had cost her, what she might have revealed, what she needed to manage before Monday morning. "Of course," she said. Her voice was as smooth as it had been when she arrived. "I want us to be on the same side, Robert. Truly. We both love Caleb." Robert looked at the ring on her finger one more time. "I know," he said. He left a 20 on the table for the coffees and buttoned his coat against the cold that was waiting outside, and he walked out of the coffee shop onto Michigan Avenue, where the January wind came down the corridor of buildings and hit him full in the face, and he let it. He needed to make a phone call. He needed to make it before Elena's car reached the expressway. He pulled out his phone and scrolled to a contact he hadn't called in 4 months. The name read Jenkins, S. He pressed call. The apartment on West Belmont had been Caleb's for 6 years. He had moved in at 26, just after his promotion to operations manager. And he had spent the first 3 weekends painting it himself a warm gray in the living room, an off-white in the bedroom, the kitchen left in its original rental beige because he ran out of time and then ran out of momentum, and somehow the beige had stayed. He'd bought the couch from a furniture store on Clybourne with his first bonus. He'd hung his mother's photograph on the wall beside the bookcase using a level and a pencil mark so it would be exactly straight. It was still exactly straight when he came home that Wednesday evening. And stood in the doorway and understood, in the way that the body sometimes understands things before the mind catches up, that something in the apartment had changed. Not the furniture, not the walls, not the photograph, still level beside the bookcase. The feeling was more specific than that. It was the feeling of a room that has been inhabited by someone else while you were away, a particular, subtle rearrangement of the air itself. He set his keys on the counter and opened his laptop. He went to his bank's website. He typed his username. He typed his password. The username or password you entered is incorrect. Please try again. He tried again. Same result. He sat down at the kitchen table and tried the secondary verification method. The security questions and reached the screen that told him his account access had been restricted and he should contact customer service during business hours. He called customer service. He was on hold for 11 minutes, listening to a recorded voice tell him his call was important, before a representative answered and told him, in the careful, apologetic language of someone delivering news. They've been trained to deliver without involvement, that the account passwords had been changed from an authorized device at 247 that afternoon, and that the changes had been confirmed through the 2-factor authentication code sent to the phone number on file. The phone number on file was Elena's number. He had made that change in October, when she told him it was more efficient for her to coordinate the financial alerts, given how often he was in the field during the day. He sat with the phone against his ear after the representative finished speaking, and he said, "Okay," and he ended the call. He set the phone on the table. He looked at his laptop screen, at the login page still open with its empty fields, and he thought about the number that lived behind that login page, the number that represented $211,000. Which was 10 years of maximized contributions and employer matches and the particular financial discipline of a man who had decided, at 22, that he would not be the kind of person who had nothing saved at 30. $211,000. He had opened the account at 22 with his first full-time paycheck. He had added to it through the years when money was tight and the years when it wasn't, through the years when he was healthy. And the year he'd had surgery on his knee and spent 6 weeks wondering if the operations job was going to survive his absence. He had left it untouched through every temptation to pull from it the car he'd wanted at 27. The apartment upgrade he'd considered at 29 because he understood, with the kind of understanding that lives below opinion and closer to conviction, that it was the one thing standing between him and the feeling of having no ground under his feet. He was one click away from someone else standing there instead. He got up from the table. He didn't know why he got up. He walked to the living room and stood in the middle of it for a moment, looking at the couch he'd bought with his first bonus, at the bookshelves he'd built from a flat-pack kit over a long weekend, at the window that looked out onto the street, where the winter light was already failing at 4:30 in the afternoon. Then his legs went out from under him in the way that tiredness sometimes works, not dramatically. Not a collapse, just a slow and quiet declension, and he sat down on the floor with his back against the couch. He sat there for a long time. At some point he reached over to the coffee table and picked up the two things that were on it. His Medicare card, which he'd been meaning to sort into his wallet for 2 weeks. And his father's old CPD badge, the one Robert had pressed into his hand at Margaret's funeral. With the wordless gravity of a man handing over something that had kept him whole and hoping it might do the same. Caleb had kept it on the coffee table ever since. He wasn't sure why. It wasn't a thing you displayed. It was just a thing you kept nearby, the way you keep aspirin in the drawer even when you don't have a headache. He held both objects in his hands. The Medicare card smooth and plastic and new. The badge worn at the edges, the enamel on the CPD seal slightly chipped at the bottom right corner from some long ago contact with a concrete floor. He stared at them. If I lose this, I have no future. The thought arrived with the flat, declarative certainty of a thing that has been true for a while and is only now being spoken aloud, even internally. I'm just a zero. A man who had something and let it be taken. The street lamp outside the living room window flickered once, then settled into a light that was intermittent, unreliable, steady for a few seconds, then cutting out for a moment, then returning. He watched it. He couldn't explain why he kept watching it. Maybe because in a room where everything else felt unstable, the flickering lamp at least was honest about its instability. It wasn't pretending. He thought about Alina's voice at Sunday dinner, explaining yield projections. He thought about the Malbec she always brought, opened by her own hand. He thought about the way she had looked around his father's kitchen the first time she came, measuring. He thought about giving her his mother's ring. That was the one he kept coming back to. That was the one that made his chest do the particular thing it was doing now, not pain. Not exactly, but pressure. The feeling of something that should have room to expand not having it. He had given it to her in November, on a night when they had stayed late at the apartment and the wine was good. And she had looked at him across the kitchen table with an expression that he now understood had been composed as deliberately as everything else about her. He had gone to the box in the bedroom where he kept the few things of his mother's. He had taken the ring. A small photograph, a recipe card in Margaret's handwriting, and he had brought the ring out and set it on the table and said something inadequate about wanting her to have it. Elena had not cried. She had looked at the ring for a moment, and then she had put it on, and she had smiled. He knew now what the smile meant. He had known it somewhere below articulation for weeks, maybe months. That was the worst part. Not the knowing, but the how long he had known without letting himself know. The street lamp flickered again. Outside, the Chicago evening settled into full dark, and the wind pushed against the window. And the city went on being the city, indifferent, enormous, magnificent in its total lack of interest in any single person's floor-level reckoning. Caleb looked at the badge in his hand. He looked at it for a long time. The chipped enamel at the corner. The weight of it, which was specific and real and had not changed in 30 years. He took out his phone. He didn't call his father, not yet. Not from the floor of his own living room with his hands still uncertain. But he held the phone. He held the badge. He sat with both of them in the flickering light and let himself arrive, slowly and with some difficulty, at the place where despair either ends or doesn't. Outside, a siren moved through the distance, growing and fading. The lamp steadied for a long moment, then flickered once more, but it came back. Friends, what a journey we've traveled with Caleb and Robert so far. From that first quiet Sunday dinner, where something as simple as 3 taps on a shoe beneath a table set everything in motion, to Caleb sitting alone on the floor of his apartment, holding his father's badge and wondering if there's any way back from this. Elena has been careful, she has been patient, and she has taken more than money. She's taken trust. She's taken a ring that belonged to a woman Caleb loved and lost. And she has left a good man questioning his own judgment. But Robert Miller spent 30 years watching people like Elena. And Caleb sent the signal. In the second half of this story, we're going to find out what a retired fraud investigator and his son can do when they stop being afraid and start being ready. Don't go anywhere. The memory arrived the way the most important ones always do, not when sought, but when the mind has finally gone quiet enough to receive it. It was 1999. January, which seemed right. Chicago winters had a way of being present in every hard memory Caleb carried, as if the cold were not merely weather, but a condition of significance, the city's way of marking the moments that would last. He was 6 years old and standing in a room full of adults whose grief was so large it had become a kind of architecture, reshaping the space around him so that the ceiling felt lower and the walls felt closer and the air smelled of flowers and something underneath the flowers that he didn't have a name for. His grandmother's funeral. His father's mother, a woman who had called him her Chicago boy and kept a tin of butter cookies in the kitchen cupboard specifically for his visits. He did not understand death at 6. He understood absence. He understood that the tin of butter cookies would be in the cupboard and she would not. And that this was a permanent condition, and the permanence of it was what made the room feel the way it did. His father was across the room. Robert in his 30s, dark hair, the same jaw Caleb now saw in his own mirror, standing near the door, talking on a cell phone that was large and black and made him look like he was holding a brick against his ear. Even at a funeral, the job. Even here, Caleb had sat on a wooden bench against the wall and watched the room and felt the particular, specific loneliness of being small. In a space organized entirely around the emotions of people who were not thinking about you. He had looked at his father. His father was not looking at him. He had extended his foot under the bench. In the dark below the wooden seat, he had pressed the toe of his small shoe against the side of Robert's dress shoe. Tap, tap, tap. His father had kept talking. 5 more seconds. 10. Then the call ended. And Robert had reached down without looking, without bending, without ceremony, and taken Caleb's hand in his. A large hand around a small one, warm through the cold of the room, steady in the way that his father's hands were always steady. He had not let go for the rest of the service. In the present, sitting in his car in the parking structure on Lower Wacker with the engine off and the cold coming through the glass, Caleb understood something he had not consciously understood before, though some part of him had always known it. He had sent the same signal again because Robert was the only person in his life who, 30 years ago, had proven that it would be received. Not with words, not with a plan, just with a hand, just with the wordless communication that someone was there and would stay there. Elena had offered him many things. She had offered him structure and strategy and yield projections and the particular comfort of feeling chosen by someone competent and certain. What she had never offered, not once in 7 months, was simply to stay. He thought about the badge in his jacket pocket, which he'd been carrying since the night on the floor of his apartment. He thought about his father, who had spent 30 years paying attention so that one day he might know exactly what to do with what he noticed. He thought about what came next. And something shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the quiet certainty of a foundation settling back into level ground. The despair was still there. It did not disappear, because real things do not disappear on command. But it was no longer the largest thing in the room. What was larger now, and growing, was something older and more durable than fear. He started the engine. He picked up his phone. He texted his father 4 words: "I'm ready. Tell me." The response came in under a minute. "Come to the car. Tonight." Robert's car was parked on a side street off of Damon, 3 blocks from Caleb's apartment, in the shadow of a streetlight that had been out since before Thanksgiving. He had chosen the spot 2 days ago, when he had driven the route 4 times and identified the particular combination of low foot traffic and sightline advantages that 30 years of fieldwork had taught him to look for automatically, without thinking about it as strategy. The way a musician doesn't think about where to put their fingers. Caleb climbed into the passenger seat and pulled the door shut. The interior was warm. Robert had been there for 20 minutes, long enough to take the chill out of the air. And it smelled like the specific combination of Irish Spring soap and the cedar air freshener that had hung from Robert's rearview mirror for as long as Caleb could remember. For a moment they sat there without speaking. Robert had the dome light off. The windows were beginning to fog slightly at the edges. Then Robert reached into the back seat and brought forward a small black case. The kind that might hold glasses or a pen set, and opened it on the center console. Inside, nested in foam, was a digital recorder roughly the size of a thick credit card and a wireless microphone element. Not much larger than a shirt button, with a short length of thin wire and a clip. This is legal in Illinois, Robert said. One-party consent state. You're a participant in the conversation. Everything she says is admissible. Caleb looked at it. Where'd you get it? I still have contacts in purchasing. Consider it a long-term loan. Robert picked up the microphone element and held it under the dome light for a moment, examining the connector. I also have a conversation I want you to have with Detective Sarah Jenkins. Caleb looked over at him. Jenkins, Robert said, has been running the financial crimes unit for 6 years. Before that she was my trainee for 4. She's the best I ever worked with, and she is currently building a case file on a pattern of unlicensed wealth consulting activity that has cost 11 people in Cook County. A combined total of approximately $1.3 million over the past 3 years. He set the microphone back in the case. She can't run an official investigation on what I've given her informally. But she's given me enough from her existing case to understand exactly what Elena Vance does, how she does it, and what it takes to make it stick in court. Has Jenkins seen the POA form? She has a photograph of it. She says it matches 3 other POA documents from Elena's previous targets. Robert closed the case and set it on the console between them. Here's what we know. Elena is not licensed. The Lakeshore Fund has a Delaware registration but no verifiable assets under management. Meridian Capital Strategies is a shell entity. She has used the same playbook on at least 4 people we can identify emotionally vulnerable, recently. Bereaved or isolated, assets in the low to mid 6 figures, no immediate family member positioned to scrutinize. He looked at his son. She looked at you after your mother died and she saw an opening. The words landed in the car with a weight that neither of them acknowledged directly. Caleb looked at the recorder case. What do you need from me? He said. I need her to talk. Robert opened the case again and began threading the microphone wire through his fingers, checking its length. She's going to push you to sign the POA tomorrow. You're going to tell her you want to do it, but you have one last question. You want to understand exactly how the Lakeshore Fund handles the transfer, what the timeline is. And specifically how the money will be positioned in the first 72 hours. Use those words. 72 hours. Let her explain it in her own language. Because if she describes the offshore routing, then she's described the mechanism of the fraud on tape, in her own words, in your apartment, to you specifically. It's not entrapment. You're not law enforcement. You're a private individual asking questions about your own money. Robert handed Caleb the microphone. Jenkins will be 2 blocks away. I'll be outside your building. The moment you have what we need, you text me 1 word. What word? Sunday. Caleb looked at the microphone in his hand. Small. Lighter than he expected. He turned it over once. I'm ready, Dad, he said. Let's finish this. Robert looked at him for a moment with the particular expression of a parent who has spent years watching a child carry weight he didn't deserve and is now watching that same person choose to set it down in the right way. Wire goes inside the jacket lining, Robert said. Left side, below the pocket. The recorder clips to your belt at the back, under the shirt. Caleb turned in his seat and Robert ran the wire, working with the steady, practiced efficiency of a man who had done this in 100 situations more difficult than this one, and not one of them more important. They checked the recorder 3 times. The levels were clean. Go, Robert said. Caleb got out of the car. He walked the 3 blocks back to West Belmont without hurrying, his hands in his jacket pockets, his breath even invisible in the cold January air. The city moved around him. A bus on Damon, a dog walker on the sidewalk ahead, the orange glow of a taqueria through its fogged front window. He reached his building and pressed the entry code. The door buzzed open. From the third-floor window, a light was on. He could see it from the sidewalk, the particular warm, domestic light of his own living room lamp, the one Elena would have turned on when she came in with her key, which he had given her in October and would never give anyone again without understanding the full weight of what a key means. He went inside. Elena was at the kitchen table, the laptop open in front of her, a glass of wine already poured. She looked up when he came in and smiled, warm, precise, exactly the width it needed to be. "I was starting to wonder," she said. "Ready to talk about tomorrow?" The recorder was running. The wire was clean. 2 blocks away, a CPD detective sat in a parked car with her own equipment running and 30 years of her mentor's training behind her eyes. "I'm ready," Caleb said. He set his keys on the counter. "But I have one more question. About the 72 hours. The air in the apartment turned very still. Elena's composure was a thing of technical precision. Caleb could see it now with the clarity that comes when you know what you're watching for. She tilted her head slightly at the mention of 72 hours, and a small, patient smile arranged itself across her face. And she picked up her wineglass with the unhurried ease of a woman who has answered this question many times before, because she has, and because every time she answered it, the man or woman across the table accepted the answer and signed on the line. "That's a smart question," she said. "That's the kind of question I want you asking." She set the wine down and turned the laptop toward him slightly. The screen showed a transfer interface, an account portal he didn't recognize, with fields for routing numbers and account designations. And a transfer amount that had been pre-populated with a figure that made his vision briefly sharpen. $211,000. All of it, she began to explain. The Lakeshore Fund, she said, operated through a layered holding structure. The initial transfer from Caleb's 401k would move to an intermediary account held in the name of Meridian Capital Strategies, a standard administrative step, she said, used by all boutique funds to manage liquidity during the onboarding window. From there, within 48 to 72 hours, the assets would be distributed across the fund's primary instruments, including what she called an offshore liquidity reserve that provided the fund with protection against domestic market volatility. Offshore, Caleb said, meaning outside the United States. Meaning in a jurisdiction that provides structural advantages for the kind of yield optimization we're talking about, Elena said smoothly. It's entirely standard for funds at this level. The assets are protected from IRS reporting requirements during the transition window, which is actually a tax advantage for you in the short term. So in 72 hours, the money would be invisible to the IRS within 72 hours, Elena said. And she said it with the easy confidence of someone who has reached the closing portion of a transaction they have already decided is complete. That's the design of the structure. That's what makes it efficient. She reached into her portfolio and produced the power of attorney form, already unfolded, and set it on the table beside the laptop. She placed her pen beside it. "Once you sign this, I can initiate the transfer tonight. We don't need to wait until Monday. The sooner we move, the better positioned you are for the first quarter." Caleb looked at the form. He looked at the pen. He thought about sitting on the floor of his living room in the dark, holding his father's badge. He thought about the Medicare card, smooth and new. He thought about a wooden bench at a funeral and 3 taps in the dark and a large, steady hand closing around a small one. He looked up from the form, and he looked at Elena's left hand, resting on the table, and on her ring finger the rose gold setting caught the kitchen light, the garnet at its center. Deep red and still, and he held the sight of it for exactly 1 second. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and left his hand there and did not move. The door of his apartment opened with the sound of a key in a lock, not his key, not Elena's, and Detective Sarah Jenkins came through it first. Her shield already in her hand, with 2 uniformed officers behind her. And the particular forward momentum of people who have practiced this entry until it has no wasted motion in it. "Elena Vance," Jenkins said. Her voice was even and professional and carried the weight of 6 years of financial crimes work and 30 years of Robert Miller's training behind it. "I'm detaining you for questioning in connection with an ongoing financial fraud investigation." Please step away from the table. For one full second, Elena did not move. Then her face did something Caleb had not seen it do before. The composure, the precisely calibrated warmth, the patient smile, the measured tilt of the head, all of it dropped away at once, not gradually, not in stages, but all at once, like a coat falling from a hook. What was underneath it was not fear, not yet. It was something older and more specific, the expression of a person who has run a calculation and arrived, for the first time in a very long time, at the answer 0. Then the calculation completed itself, and what replaced it was fury, cold, contained, directed. She looked at Caleb. You did this, she said. Her voice had changed. The silk was gone from it. What was underneath was flat and hard, the sound of a person who has stopped performing. Caleb didn't look away. He had made himself a promise, in the parking structure on Lower Wacker, sitting in the dark with his father's badge in his pocket, that when this moment came he would not look away from it. That he would stand in it the way his father had stood in interview rooms for 30 years. With the settled, patient attention of a person who has done what needed doing and is not ashamed of it. You were going to take everything I had, he said. Everything I spent 10 years building. And you were going to do it wearing my mother's ring. Elena looked at him for one more second. Then the officers were at the table, and Jenkins was speaking formally about rights and procedures. And the handcuffs closed with the small, metallic, definitive sound of a lock engaging. From somewhere outside the sidewalk, 3 floors down, Robert Miller stood in the January cold with his hands in his coat pockets and heard, after a moment, the particular change in the ambient sound of a building when something has been resolved inside it. A quality of stillness, the kind that comes after. He took out his phone. There was one text on the screen. One word, Sunday. He stood on West Belmont and looked up at the lit window on the 3rd floor and felt, moving through the cold air around him, something he had not felt for a long time, not since a courtroom in 2019. Not since a verdict that had taken 11 months to reach and had arrived in the voice of a jury foreperson with a composure that had broken only after the words were said. The particular satisfaction of a system working the way it was designed to work. Of the law writing, in ink, what his heart had been saying for a long time in a language that didn't need words. Today, the law wrote in ink what my heart had been shouting in silence. Upstairs, Elena Vance was led out of Caleb's apartment and into the hallway where the fluorescent building lights were honest and unkind. And she was guided down 3 flights of stairs and out the front door of the building and into the Chicago night where a CPD vehicle was waiting with its lights running quietly. Caleb stood in the doorway of his apartment and watched her go. He did not watch with satisfaction, exactly. He watched with something more specific and more quiet than that, the feeling of having done an accurate thing. Of having seen a situation clearly and acted on what he saw, and of having done it with his father's voice in his ear and his father's badge in his pocket. And 30 years of his father's careful attention working behind him like a current. The siren of the vehicle started up as it pulled into the street and then faded, moving north on Damon, growing smaller with distance until it was indistinguishable from the general voice of the city. The hallway was empty. The apartment was still. The kitchen light was on, and the laptop was still open on the table, and the wine glass Elena had poured for herself sat beside it, full, untouched by anyone who intended to drink it. Caleb let out a long, slow breath. He took out his phone. He called his father. Robert answered on the first ring. I know, Robert said, before Caleb could speak. I heard it from down here. Is she? Jenkins has her. It's done. A pause. The sound of the street behind Robert's voice, wind moving through a city at night. How are you? Caleb looked around his apartment. At the couch from Clybourne. At the bookshelves he'd built himself. At the photograph of his mother on the wall beside the bookcase, still exactly level, the pencil mark still there beside the nail if you knew where to look. I'm okay, he said. And then, because it was true, I think I might actually be okay. He heard his father breathe out. It was a very particular breath, the breath of a man who has been holding something for a long time and has been given permission, finally, to set it down. Come on, Robert said. I'll buy you breakfast. There's a diner on Fullerton that does the eggs right. Caleb put on his jacket. He turned off the kitchen light. He closed the apartment door behind him and walked down 3 flights of stairs and out into the Chicago night, where the cold was honest. And the streets were lit and his father's car was parked at the corner with its engine running and the windows already defrosted. Somewhere in the city, a police siren faded to silence. What was left in its place was quiet. The deep, specific quiet of something finished. And for the first time in 7 months, Caleb Miller walked toward it without fear. 3 weeks later, on a Sunday in February, the radiator in Robert's kitchen was doing what it always did. It clanked. It settled. It announced itself against the silence of a winter morning in the particular way it had been announcing itself for 11 years. And Robert stood at the counter and listened to it without irritation, because it was the sound of the house, and the house was his, and this morning that felt like enough. The smell of coffee moved through the kitchen. Not pot roast that was for evenings, for the formal assertion of Sunday dinner as a thing that mattered. This was morning. This was the simpler version, coffee and eggs and the soft gray light coming through the window above the sink. The kind of light that Chicago produces in February when the clouds are high in uniform and the city is briefly, quietly, itself. Caleb sat at the kitchen table with a document in front of him. Not a power of attorney. Not a quarterly statement with someone else's handwriting in the margin. It was a single-page document with the heading Fiduciary Disclosure, Client Rights and Advisor Obligations. And Robert had printed it from the FINRA website at 7:30 that morning and set it on the table beside a cup of coffee before Caleb was fully awake. "Read the second paragraph," Robert said, without turning from the counter. Caleb read the second paragraph. He read it again. He picked up the coffee. "It says the advisor is legally required to act in the client's interest. Not just encouraged to," Robert said. "Required. That's the word that matters. The distinction between a fiduciary standard and a suitability standard is the difference between a person who is legally obligated to put your interests first and a person who is only obligated to recommend something that isn't actively terrible for you." He turned and leaned against the counter, holding his own cup. "That's the first question you ask anyone who touches your money from now on. Are you a fiduciary? Yes or no? And if they say no, then you thank them for their time and you leave." Caleb looked at the document again. Then he looked at his father standing there in his weekend clothes, the CPD coffee mug he'd had since 2003 in his right hand. The kitchen light catching the gray at his temples, and felt something move through him that he didn't immediately have a name for. Something warm and specific. "The 401k, Caleb said. "What's the timeline on the freeze?" "Jenkins says they'll hold it as part of the evidence record for the case. But the freeze on your access should lift within 60 days once the court issues the protective order. The account itself is intact. All $211,000. Robert took a sip of coffee. "In the meantime, the mortgage servicer has agreed to a temporary forbearance pending the fraud documentation. That buys us 4 months to restructure without penalty." "You got them to agree to that?" "I made a phone call." A pause. 3 phone calls. Caleb looked at the table. He looked at the fiduciary disclosure. He thought about a December evening 7 months ago when Elena Vance had walked into this kitchen with a bottle of Malbec and the particular smile of a person who has already decided what they are going to take. He thought about the Sunday dinners between then and now, the ones where he had sat across from her and said, "Everything is fine, Dad," while his knuckles went white around the stem of a wine glass. He thought about the floor of his apartment. The Medicare card. The badge. He thought about how close it had been. $211,000 close. 1 signature on 1 line on 1 Monday morning close. He thought about 3 taps on the top of a shoe. "There's something I've been thinking about," Caleb said. Robert waited. "Jenkins mentioned when she came to take my statement, she mentioned there are other people. Other targets. She said the case file has 4 confirmed victims and she thinks there are more who haven't come forward yet." Caleb wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "People who are too embarrassed, or they don't know what happened was a crime, or they don't think anyone will believe them." He looked up. "I was almost one of those people. I was a month away from being one of those people." Robert nodded slowly. "Jenkins asked if I'd be willing to talk to them," Caleb said. "The other victims. She said sometimes people come forward faster when they hear from someone who went through the same thing and came out the other side. She said it doesn't have to be formal, it could just be a phone call. A conversation. And? Robert said. I said yes. Caleb looked at the window. The February light was steady and gray and honest. I said yes because someone paid attention when I needed it. Someone knew how to read a signal. He paused. I think the least I can do is be the person who knows how to listen when someone else sends one. Robert looked at his son for a moment. 32 years of watching this person grow from something small and uncertain into something that knew its own weight. He thought about a wooden bench at a funeral in 1999 and a small foot pressing against his shoe in the dark. He thought about the way he had reached down without looking, because looking hadn't been necessary. Because some signals you receive below the level of thought. He set his coffee cup on the counter. He poured himself a fresh cup. He brought the pot to the table and filled Caleb's cup without being asked. Caleb picked up the fiduciary disclosure and read through it one more time, slowly. The way Robert had been reading documents at this table for 31 years of Sunday mornings. His eyes moved steadily across the page. His coffee steamed. The radiator made its sound. When he finished reading, he set the document down on the table and looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at his father. And without a word, he reached out and rested his foot against the side of Robert's shoe. Once. Just once. Light as breath. Robert went very still. He set his coffee cup down carefully. He looked at the window, at the gray February light, at the snow that had begun, sometime in the last few minutes, to fall in the slow and unhurried way. It sometimes falls in Chicago when the weather has nothing to prove. He did not reach down and take his son's hand this time. This time he simply left his foot where it was, steady and solid on the kitchen floor, so that the signal had something to press against. A father and a son in a kitchen in Chicago on a Sunday morning in February, with coffee and a fiduciary disclosure and the snow coming down outside, and the radiator doing what it had always done. And a table that meant what it had always meant, that they were here, and they were at it together. And whatever came next would find them exactly where they were, seated at the same table, facing the same direction. That was enough. That was more than enough. Friends, how did that land with you? I have to be honest with you, when I think about Caleb, sitting on the floor of that apartment, holding his father's old badge and staring at a flickering street lamp, wondering if he had any future left, that image stays with me. Because that's what real loss feels like. Not the dramatic kind, the quiet kind, the kind where no one is watching and you're just alone with what you almost let happen. But then I think about 3 taps on a shoe. Something so small. Something a 6-year-old boy did at a grandmother's funeral because he didn't have words for what he needed. And a man who was busy and distracted and grieving himself, he still felt it. He still answered it. That's the heart of this story, isn't it? It's not really about Elena Vance, or the 401k, or even the sting. It's about what happens when someone who loves you has paid enough attention to know your signal and you trust them enough to send it. We all have moments in our lives where we realize we've let the wrong person too close. Where we understand, too late or just in time, that someone was measuring what they could take rather than honoring what we had given. Elena looked at Caleb's grief and saw an opening. Robert looked at his son's knuckles, white around a wineglass, and saw a man who needed backup. The difference between those two ways of seeing someone, that's everything. And Caleb, at the end, choosing to make himself available to the other victims. Choosing to be the person who picks up the phone when someone else's signal comes in. That's not a small thing. That's what it looks like when a hard experience becomes something useful, when what almost broke you becomes the reason you can hold the door open for someone still trying to get through. It's never too late for that. It is genuinely never too late. Friends,